Hello, everybody. I can see the numbers starting to accumulate. I'm joining you all the way from Melbourne, Australia, but I would love to know where you are joining me from. Of course, this is South by Southwest online, so you could be not only in Austin, but anywhere in the world. So perhaps in the chat window, if you don't mind sharing, where are you joining me from? I'd love to know. Colombia, New York City, Sydney. Hello, Sydney Sider. Malmo, Sweden, the home of Zlatan Ibrahimovic. Munich, beautiful place with beautiful beer, as does Belgium. Antwerp, is that the Hoopila beer, I believe, in Antwerp? Seattle, New Mexico, Portland. It's all happening. We've got people coming in from all over the world. This is exciting. So we're going to kick this session off in about a minute or so, just to let a few more numbers pile in. We've got over 354 registered for this session. So I'm really humbled that so many people find this topic, that this topic resonates with so many people. And I'm excited to teach you what I've learned today and hopefully inspire you to different ways of work. Salt Lake City represent. LA. Boleki, is that how you say it? The Antwerp beer? Fantastic. Yeah, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, Joran. Awesome, awesome. Well, we're going to kick this session off. It is 2 minutes past the hour, and I am super excited to be here with you. Let's get right into it. How to get twice as much done in half the time. So my name is Steve Glaveski, and I am joining you from Melbourne, Australia. Of course, if I had a say in the matter, I would be on stage in Austin, perhaps at a Texan barbecue house, crowd surfing at a punk rock concert in Austin, or at the risk of using a dated Texan stereotype, riding a mechanical bull. But here I am in my study. And yes, those are Bill and Ted bobbleheads on my desk. Now, that brings me to something. So while I would much rather be on stage in Austin, I did save myself about 16 hours in flight times. Now, that brings me to today's topic. Now, having saved 16 hours, that's what we're talking about today. How to get twice as much done in half the time. But nowadays, when you ask someone how they're going, chances are they're going to say busy, crazy busy, which typically means that they are out of control. I mean, we could work 12-hour days, 5 days a week, but have very little to show for it come the end of the week, other than poor health, suffering personal relationships, and ultimately suffering personal relationships, excuse me, poor health, and really not too much to show for it. In fact, in the United States, 5 to 8% of healthcare costs are attributable to workplace stress. In fact, 120,000 deaths a year attributable to workplace stress, which is typically a byproduct of a lack of control and no autonomy over one's work, as well as excessive workloads. But it doesn't have to be this way. So why listen to me when it comes to this topic of getting more done in less time? Well, I prepared a short video to explain.
So who am I,
who I
and why
am,
should you listen to me?
and why you should
Well,
listen to
I was once a 12-hour a day, beat your chest and hustle guy, until I realized that it left me burnt out, moving no closer to my goals, and with little time for family, friends, or my personal interests. Because of this, I spent countless hours researching and applying different techniques to learn what works on both an individual level and as part of a team. And as a result, in the past 5 years, I've built a 7-figure consulting business, published 5 books, recorded over 500 podcast episodes, spun off a kids entrepreneurship program, built a media network, spoke on stages all over the world, and built this course. But here's the kicker. I spend about 6 hours a day working. Sometimes it's even less. I wrote about this for Harvard Business Review in an article called The Case for the 6-Hour Workday. The article went viral, and it led to me securing a book deal to write Time Rich: Do Your Best Work, Live Your Best Life. The book has been endorsed by huge names in the world of business and psychology, such as Adam Grant and Mia Eyal.
Okay, so with I will share my arm workout, Shane. So with that introduction out of the way, what we'll be looking at today is essentially the blockers that get in the way of your productivity, how to overcome those blockers, 6 keys to high performance. And at the end of the session, I'm going to allocate about 30 minutes for Q&A. So you can ask as many questions as you like. And Shane, yes, you can ask about my arm workout then. But first, a story. Back in 1939, the Soviet Union sent about 800,000 troops across the border into Finland. Now, the Finns, they kept a very small peacetime army, and the Soviets, as we know, were a world power. But the Finns actually won the battle on the ground 8-1. The Soviets suffered 200,000 casualties, whereas the Finns only suffered 25,000 casualties. Now, why were the Finns so dominant despite their inferior size? Well, they operated in small teams, independently of each other, making fast decisions and adapting to changes on the ground, adapting to changing circumstances on the ground. Whereas the Soviets really relied on centralized command from Moscow. They operated much slower. So with the Finns, it wasn't so much that they had a larger workforce or more resources. They didn't. They won because of the way they worked. Not only that, but they wore these white tunics to take on the impression of ghosts as they picked off their Soviet adversaries one by one in the woods. Now, when it comes to the way we work, it's obviously changed a lot in the last 120 years or so. I mean, if you were lucky enough to have a job back in 1900, you were probably on an assembly line, in a factory, or on a coal mine, or in a coal mine. Now, it was about this time that Robert Owen, a textile manufacturer from Great Britain, actually lobbied for the 8-hour workday under the moniker 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours play. But it wasn't until 1937 that the 8-hour workday was ratified into law in the United States, at least, under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But a lot has changed since 1937. You know, the way we work has changed. Back in the Industrial Revolution, if you were on an assembly line, if you were standing by a conveyor belt, you could draw a straight line between hours and output, presence and productivity. You know, it was a very linear relationship. But when it comes to the way we work today, for those of us in this session, most of us, if not all of us, are knowledge workers. And when it comes to how work has shifted in the last 100 years, we have more autonomy over our work. We have broader task scope. Our work is more cognitively complex, and our work requires us to interact with other people. Now, essentially, we've moved from algorithmic process-oriented work towards cognitive knowledge work. And when we do knowledge work, it doesn't really make sense to manage time the way we would on an assembly line. What we should be looking to do is manage attention. And when it comes to managing our attention, we need to get better at cultivating what psychologists call the flow state, when we are completely immersed in one thing and the rest of the world seems to just fade away. Kind of like riding a wave. If anybody surfs in the room, you'll know that when you're surfing, when you're riding that wave, you're not thinking about what bills you have to pay, an argument you might have had with someone. You're just totally immersed in that one thing. And McKinsey, the consulting firm, actually ran a 10-year study where they found that people are up to 5 times more productive when they are in flow versus when they are in that sort of shallow level state. But when it comes to flow, at work at least, turns out that 4 hours is the upper limit. I mean, there's numerous examples of this from both the working world as well as the world outside of work. For example, violinists at the Berlin Conservatory of Music. For centuries, they have only put in about 4 hours of deliberate practice each day because instructors there know that they hit the point of diminishing returns very quickly thereafter. Charles Darwin, who founded the theory of evolution, worked about 5 hours a day, and one of those hours was for lunch. And finally, a study that was performed where 3 groups of scientists, each working 20 hours, 35 hours, and 60 hours a week, were assessed for their productivity. How many journal articles would they contribute? Counterintuitively, Turned out that the 20-hour-a-week group were twice as productive as the 35-hour-a-week group. 60-hour-a-week group were the least productive. Now, turns out that the more hours we allocate to work, we tend to fill it with a lot of shallow level stuff and waste more time. Not only that, but we are human beings. We are not T800 sent back from the future. We need to rest and rejuvenate in order to get the best out of our minds. So when we're, pumping out these 60 to 80-hour weeks for a long period of time, that might work for a week or two, but long term, it's really not sustainable for most people. But the thing about that is, even though 4 hours is the upper limit of flow when it comes to our work, most of us are lucky to get just 1 hour of flow in a glorified 12-hour workday. Now, why might this be the case? Well, when people say they're time poor, typically what it means is that we are decision poor. And I'm going to talk through the different ways that we go about sabotaging our time and what those bad decisions are. Now, I'll be introducing some visual mnemonics or acronyms today to help you remember some of these concepts. Now, the first one is tires. I basically like to say that we are carrying these spare tires that slow our productivity down. And tires stands for task switching, saying yes, residual work, the path of least effort, and shallow level work. So let's kick off with task switching. Nowadays, the average knowledge worker switches screens once every 40 seconds in a typical workday. That's 373 screen switches over the course of a 9 to 5 workday. Whether it's swiping on our phones, whether it's checking Slack, whether it's checking our mentions on LinkedIn, or just spending hours in our inbox, we are bouncing around from screen to screen. In fact, when it comes to the typical average person, they're receiving 46 push notifications a day. They're sending and receiving 94 instant messages. We're being physically interrupted 50 to 60 times a day, and we spend 4 hours a day on our smartphones, which equates to about 8 weeks a year. So on that question, if you use an Apple phone, check your settings, find out what your screen time is, and post it in the chat window. Similarly, if you're on Android, you should have access to an app called Digital Wellbeing, which will tell you the same. I'd love to know what your screen time is. A lot of people don't check this anywhere near enough, and when they see it, they're blown away by just how high that number is. Valentina, 4 hours. Chloe, we need to talk. 2 hours, 17, not too bad. But you're in control. Yep. So we're seeing a lot of large numbers come through. And of course, you can then dig a little bit deeper and see what's that attributable to. Like, is that 3 hours on Instagram each day? In which case, if that's how you choose to spend your time, that's aligned with your values, that's great. If it's you being perhaps reactive and involuntarily responding to things and notifications and whatnot, you might need to reflect on how you're using it. But the problem with this is when we switch screens or when we switch tasks, we suffer a cognitive switching penalty of about 23 minutes. So if you happen to be in flow and you switch screens, it would take you about 23 minutes to get back in the zone after that interruption. So if we're switching screens every 40 seconds, if we're checking email every 6 minutes, well, it's not hard to see why people are struggling to get just a solitary hour of deep work into their day. So that was task switching. Why in tires? For saying yes. There is a common saying, you'll hear people in the sort of personal development world say, you should say yes to everything because it will create the space for serendipity. Now that might be true, but when you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to everything else. So we need to be conscious that we're not saying no inadvertently to our own goals and our own priorities. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Seneca the Younger, the Roman philosopher and statesman, who said that people are frugal when it comes to guarding their personal property and their wealth, but not so their time, which is the one thing it's right to be stingy with, because time, unlike money, cannot be earned back when you spend it. So being more conscious about what we say yes to. The R in tires for residual work. And before I even talk about this, I'm going to play this video, which perfectly illustrates what residual work is. We've got Forrest Gump here playing college football. He's charging for the end zone. He gets to the end zone and he just keeps on running. He knocks out the marching band and off he goes into the dressing rooms. Like he is well past the point of diminishing returns. Now, this can happen in our work too, where we will say work on a PowerPoint presentation for an hour or so and continue to tweak the formatting, as is the case on the screen, for another 3 hours. And that's oftentimes because we get comfortable with the task, the value is delivered, and it's so easy to just keep working on that than to move on to something else. The path of least effort. So, as human beings, we are biologically wired to take the path of least effort because this would have served us well on the African savannah tens of thousands of years ago, where we could go days without eating. So, our brains evolved to conserve energy. But this might have served us well then, but when it comes to our work, we sit down at our desks and it's so much easier to check Twitter, check LinkedIn, check email, do all these things instead of get started with that more difficult tasks that actually requires us to apply some cognition. Now, the problem with that is that most things require us to put in the effort. If we want those proverbial bags of gold, we're going to need to dig deep, and getting to inbox zero isn't really going to reward us all that much. And aside from task switching, saying yes, residual work, and the path of least effort, the S in tires is essentially shallow work. So all of these things that I've talked about will put us in a state where we're just doing shallow level work. But there are obviously meetings to contend with, meetings that don't need to happen, meetings that are just too long by default, meetings with too many people there that just don't need to be there. Email. A study was performed last year which found that people check email. The average person checks email once every 6 minutes and spends about 3 hours a day in their inbox. And again, if we're switching this often, we're not spending any time in flow doing our best work. And of course, instant messaging tools like Slack, where we can accumulate hundreds of notifications a day, many of which might not be remotely related to work and could be just cat videos, dog videos, and videos of things that perhaps aren't wholesome enough for me to mention on this chat, on this call. But essentially, all of these things combine and coalesce to get us out of deep work and out of the flow state. So with that scene set, what can we do to become more productive and cultivate more attention? I had Scott Belsky, the founder of Behance, on my podcast about a year ago. Now, he sold his company to Adobe for several $100 million. And one thing he said during that conversation that struck me was that today's true scarce resource is attention. So how can we cultivate more of it? Well, oftentimes people will talk about what we can start doing to get better at things, but sometimes subtracting things can be more effective. Like a friend of mine recently was telling me how he lost 30 kilos. And I asked, well, what's your secret? And that is about 70 pounds or so. And I asked, what's your secret? And he said, well, I just started eating more vegetables. And I thought, okay, surely there's got to be something else. Did you stop eating something? He said, well, yeah, I stopped polishing off 6 beers every night and having fast food for lunch every day. I think that might be why he lost so much weight. So when it comes to our work, what can we stop doing that's really getting in the way of us doing our best work? Well, even though social media and big tech has been villainized by documentaries like The Social Dilemma, which goes on about how big tech is exploiting vulnerabilities in our psychology, 90% of the time when we reach for our phone, that is actually internally triggered. It's our own discomfort, our stress, our anxiety, our loneliness that's getting us to do these things. It's also we've taught ourselves to seek out that tiny micro dopamine hit that comes with checking our notifications and seeing that someone's liked something we posted. So 90% of the time when we reach for our phones, it's not external notifications, it's our own internal discomforts. So how might we get over these internal discomforts or distractions? First, getting any sort of thoughts that are giving us anxiety out of our heads and onto paper by journaling. 2, try meditating if you've not done it before, because meditation actually takes certain parts of the brain offline, such as the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, which are key to emotional processing as well as sensory information processing. So it just puts us in a much calmer state where we're less likely to reach for our phones and switch screens and focus on the task at hand. You might try listening to binaural beats, which essentially stimulate the flow state, where we have two audio frequencies, one in each ear, to get us into what neuroscientists call the theta zone, which is a relaxed meditative state. Now, I'm going to play a short 5-second clip here so you can hear what binaural beats are all about, but you can try apps like Brain FM to hear these, and I believe they have free trials. Now, what you will find is when you listen to these, after about 10 or so minutes, you will find it much easier to just get into the zone and shut out the rest of the world, as these brain scans illustrate. Next, doing one thing at a time. Oh my God. These days, people find it so difficult to just do one thing at a time. Like, you could see someone at a traffic light, stopped in their car, and they'll reach for their phone. You could be at a pedestrian crossing waiting for the light and you'll reach for your phone. You could be watching Netflix, but you'll find yourself reaching for your phone. Now, what we do away from our desks transfers into how we behave at our desks. So if we cultivate that ability to just do one thing at a time, we'll be much better prepared. Our brains will be better prepared to work on one task at a time without switching and taking us out of flow. So that might be going for a walk and not looking at your phone. It might be watching the latest episode of Cobra Kai, as I tend to do, without looking at my phone. It could be reading an entire chapter of a book without looking at your phone, working out without looking at your phone. Whatever you can do to train your mind to focus on one thing goes a long way. And if you need some help with that, check out blocking apps like Blocksite or the Freedom app, because you might still find yourself, hey, let me just quickly check Twitter. Now, quickly checking Twitter for 5 minutes. Remember, it's not just a 5-minute switch, it's 23 minutes plus 5 minutes. It could incur a 28 minutes cost to our productivity. But by using, say, Blocksite, you'll see a screen like this pop up, which reminds you not to do that. So you're not getting that dopamine hit from checking Twitter. And the more you see this screen, you'll find that the frequency of your checking Twitter or some other thing that you shouldn't be switching to gets longer and longer, to the point where you don't do it at all. Kind of like training a muscle. And finally, on shutting out those internal distractions, becoming more aware. So what does that mean? Well, those days when you are on fire, what went well that morning? I mean, did you sleep well that night? Did you exercise? Did you go for a walk? Did you have a great conversation? What things put you into that great state of mind where you could get into flow and get great work done? On the flip side, those mornings when you're struggling, what was it? Did you sleep poorly? Did you have an argument with someone? Were you working on something that you just find it really difficult to get into flow with? What was it? The more you write these things down, you'll notice trends that emerge over time, and then you can cultivate and design your day around getting the best out of yourself. So that's the internal distractions. But there are, of course, external distractions. Now, 50% of people never actually change the notification settings on their smartphones or on their desktops. Now, when we're receiving, well, the average person is receiving 42 notifications, but some people, heavy duty users, are receiving hundreds of notifications a day. Their phones are constantly going off, and we're just reaching out and picking them up like Pavlov's dog responding to the ringing of a bell. Now, what can we do to eliminate these external distractions? Really simple things: turning off push notifications when you want to get into flow, using do not disturb mode when you want to get into flow, practicing environment design. So we can only use willpower we can only use so much willpower. It's finite. But what's better than willpower is environment design. If I don't want to reach for my phone or something else that I shouldn't be reaching for while I'm trying to work, well, it helps if my phone isn't on the laptop next to me and is in another room. I'm much less likely to get up and walk over to it. But if it's in front of my desk or on my desk, I'm just going to reach for it. Creating physical boundaries. So if you work with other people, if you are working from home and you're prone to being interrupted by family members or housemates, physical boundaries go a long way. Now, that could be a separate room with a closed door, or it might just be that you're wearing a pair of headphones and you've communicated that that means that you are not to be disturbed during that time because you're trying to be focused on an important task. Digital boundaries could just be blocking time in your calendar, say in the mornings if you're an early bird, to do deep work so that people can't block that time out with meetings. And communicating to people you live with, people you work with, what times of day you are available for meetings, for phone calls, and things of that persuasion. All of these things can go a long way. And when it comes to triggering the flow state, one of my favorite stories, which I'm just going to throw in here, when people talk about flow, and psychologists tend to say that you get into the flow state when you're operating at the edge of your capabilities. So if something's too difficult, you'll get disgruntled. If it's too easy, you'll get bored. And a great example of that is 5'3" Muggsy Bogues. I'm 5'8". I thought I was short. He's super short. Going up against Michael Jordan, 6'6", back in the 90s. Let's have a look at this clip. So Muggsy Bogues actually stole the ball from Michael Jordan. He was operating at the edge of his capabilities, but unfortunately for Muggsy, he did land out of bounds and the Bulls recovered the ball. So internal distractions, external distractions, getting into flow. Now, something I talked about earlier was saying yes to too many things. Now, the more we can learn to say no to things that aren't aligned with our goals, the more time we will free up. Dominic Price, the resident work futurist at Atlassian, had a problem where his entire week was back-to-back meetings. So he thought, well, what happens if I say no? And it turned out that 2/3 of the time, those meeting requests were sticks. He sent it back, it didn't come back. Only 1/3 of those requests were boomerangs that came back to him and said, no, we really need you at this meeting, Dominic. And as a result of just saying no to these meeting requests, he saved about 15 hours a week. When we get to that point of scoring that touchdown, like Forrest Gump, we should just stop, celebrate, and move on to something else. And that's essentially the difference between high producers and everybody else. High producers have a really good relationship with that point of diminishing returns. And we stop at that point and move on to something else, whether it's a new task or just doing something that's not work related. There's little value in working on something past the point of diminishing returns. We've created the value, let's move on, other than lulling ourselves into a feeling that we're being productive and busy when really we're just doing something that's easy and it validates us in some way, because work is a socially validated activity. But we can find ourselves doing it in place of other things because it just satisfies our ego and makes us feel like we are complete human beings, but really we would get a lot of value from moving on once we reach that point. So earlier I introduced the path of least effort disposition that we have to do the easiest thing. Now we can learn from Isaac Newton when it comes to overcoming this. Now he posited the laws of motion, which basically stated that an object in motion stays in motion. Now this is all about momentum. So the amount of energy required to get a ball going is much less that's required to keep that ball rolling once it's already rolling. Now, this is all about momentum. How can we get momentum going? Because once we have momentum with our work, we'll find it much easier to keep going. And just to further illustrate this point, I mean, South by Southwest is also a film festival. So you're about to see the shortest short at this film festival, which illustrates that the amount of energy required to conjure up a fireball and throw that fireball is much less than what's required to keep that fireball flying through the air. Let's have a look. Okay, so clearly I just had to find a way to incorporate that into the talk, and that seemed like a perfect place to do it. But when it comes to momentum, you can incorporate different hacks into your work to get momentum going rather than procrastinating and putting off those difficult tasks. If it's a 1,000-word article, commit to 50 words. If it is reading a book, commit to 1 page. You'll find reading the rest of the chapter becomes so much easier. If it is preparing a presentation, commit to 3 slides. And if it is, say, going to the gym, commit to turning up. Once you've got that momentum going, once that wheel is in motion, once that fireball is through the air and conjured up, it's so much easier to keep going. In fact, Ben Mesrick, who I also had the chance to speak with on my podcast, he wrote numerous bestsellers, including a couple that have been turned into best-selling movies, such as The Social Network and 21. He basically found that, or he basically likes to stop writing in the middle of a sentence. So the next day when he starts writing again, he just finishes that sentence and he is already writing. He is already back to flow and he just keeps on going. So momentum is a powerful thing. Whatever you can do to incorporate that into your work, you will find you'll waste less time procrastinating and kind of bouncing around screens and checking Twitter and get straight to work. So Naval Ravikant, obviously someone who needs no introduction to attendees at South by Southwest. Love what he says about meetings. You know, meetings should be phone calls should be emails, and emails should be texts. So some 101s on meetings. Where possible, shorter meetings. Someone somewhere decided that 60 minutes was a good default for a meeting, but really 15 minutes work in most cases. Calendar scheduling tools like calendly.com, where if somebody requests a meeting, you might just send them a link to your scheduling tool, and they might only be able to schedule 15 or 30-minute meetings at times of day when you prefer to meet. Inviting only necessary people, because if we perpetuate these cultures where we have 10-person meetings at organizations, well, then we're also going to be invited to a lot of these meetings where perhaps we're not adding too much value. Having a clear agenda, capturing next steps, because there's nothing worse than spending an hour in a meeting if there is no value creation or there are no next steps, and we need to have that meeting again to discuss what was discussed at the previous meeting. And again, don't have a meeting unless absolutely necessary. Far too often, meetings are held purely to communicate information, and in most cases, information communicated through asynchronous means, whether that's a Slack or whether that's an email that's sent to key team members. So say we ditch the spare tires, we get on top of those internal and external distractions. We stop saying yes to too many things. We scale back our meetings. We overcome that path of least effort bias. We've freed up a lot of time. But what do we do with that time? You know, Peter Drucker, the management thinker, said productivity is what you don't do. So I'm going to introduce you now to another acronym. So once we've ditched those tires, we want to put on a P code, which stands for prioritize, cut, outsource, automate, test, and start your engines. So prioritization, you know, Wilfredo Pareto, the famous Italian engineer, coined the 80-20 principle, which he found that 20% of causes are responsible for 80% of the effects. This shows up everywhere. It's a universal law of nature. The cars on our roads, 80% of cars are on 20% of the roads. 80% of the words in our books are attributable to 20% of the words in the English language. 20% of people own about 80% of the land, and 20% of customers at a large at-scale organization tend to generate about 80% of the revenue. So with that, a question for you: which causes do you think generate the majority of revenue on game day at the NFL? Just in the chat window, please. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, if you're looking at it from the perspective of TV, ads, pay-per-view revenues, all that sort of stuff is huge. If you're looking at it from the perspective of the actual stadium on the day, box tickets, so corporate boxes. You know, corporate box, I think it was Lucas Oil Stadium. They've got about 300 corporate boxes there, which sell for about $10,000 at large marquee event days, which adds up to almost what you get for a 60,000 seat stadium, which with everyone paying about $50 each. So small causes with large effects. And in fact, being 37 years old and having grown up on Mario Bros, I took it upon myself to do some research and see whether this phenomena showed true with video game sales, particularly for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And it turned out that Mario Bros 1, 2, and 3 were far beyond the unit sales that we found for the other games on the top 20 list. Now, this is just the top 20. So if you actually take that complete list of Nintendo Entertainment System games, you'll have that really long tail, and this 80-20 experiment definitely holds true when it comes to the Nintendo Entertainment System. And one of my favorite games of all time, Mario Bros. So why have I got a lion standing on a buffalo? Well, essentially, we can take more lessons from nature. You know, a lion will hunt a buffalo because it is easier to take down, but there is a lot more value in a buffalo. It's something that the pride can share rather than hunting, say, a tiger. So what are those tasks that we want to be doing in our days? Because we could be doing high effort, low value tasks, which is something we want to shy away from. But where possible, where we can optimize for the right side of this quadrant, low effort, high value, and in many cases, high effort, high value, we want to be doing that. So how do we go about hunting our proverbial buffalo? Um, quick question for you. What percentage of your time, before we get into the buffalo and the prioritization, what percentage of your time is spent on reactive tasks versus proactive? 80%. Wow. 60, 30, 60. Okay. So very big numbers. So we're going to talk through how we can try and become more proactive with our time. So firstly, quarterly planning, defining what our goals are for the next, say, 13 weeks, and identifying the tasks that are going to help us get there. Now, some simple quarterly goals here. Now, what we want to do with those subtasks is capture them somewhere, a central repository, a central source of truth. Some of you may already use Kanban boards, but I'm sure many of you also don't, where you have a backlog of tasks that need to get done in order to help you get closer to your goals. Now, we can capture all sorts of tasks in here, emails, requests, meeting actions, but most importantly, number 4, planning tasks to help us get to our quarterly goals. And we can use tools like Trello to do this. And there's numerous others out on the market, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So that Kanban might look something like this. This is for a course that I've recently put together where you have your backlog, to do, in progress, and complete. The beauty of this is people in my team can jump in and see what I'm working on. And if I have assigned tasks to people, I can also see what they're working on, which brings down that communication overhead because we're not constantly interrupting each other. But the other thing about this is it's a central source of truth. Rather than keeping a daily or weekly to-do list can keep us locked into short-term thinking and reactivity, rather than having something like this, which keeps an eye on those longer-term objectives. But it's important that we prioritize the tasks that are in there because we might have 50 or 100 tasks. So a simple thing you might want to try is just allocating a value to those tasks out of 10, allocating a cost or an effort out of 10, and then simply divide the value by the cost to get a score and prioritize by that. So in this case, coding, the value is 10, the cost is 5, which results in a 2. So we want to prioritize by that. We want to be clear about what is the buffalo task, what is the high value, low effort task that we can devote our time to today. So once you have a clear view of those tasks, you might look to create weekly plans at the end of every week for the subsequent week, which will give you a general idea of what you're working on that week. Now, that weekly plan then feeds into a daily time box. So here is something for an early birds. Early birds tend to be more productive a couple of hours after waking up. So we might block out the morning for deep work and have shallow level work in the afternoon. The flip side is true for someone who's a night owl. Night owls are more productive 10 hours after waking up. So they might want to do shallow work in the morning and deep work in the afternoon. But of course, we don't want this to be too regimented. It should be flexible and something that is subject to change because the world does throw things at us. But by doing this, we'll have a lot more intent about how we go about our work and also what we say no to. So that was the P in prioritize, the P in P codes. C, cut. Every month or quarter, I like to do this exercise with my team. Draw up a quadrant, do more, do less, start doing, stop doing, and reflect on tasks, marketing channels, sales techniques, products we're selling, customers we're targeting. Be objective, what's working, what's not, kill certain things, and then promote certain things. Over a period of, say, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, you'll find that there is this sort of compound interest effect where your team starts working on high value activities and less of stuff that just isn't adding value. Because we need to be conscious that as a team grows, we can fall victim to that whole we're doing this because that's the way we've always done it mentality. And we would definitely want to shy away from that because we can find ourselves doing things we've always done that just don't add value. So C in P codes, cut. A, automate. Nowadays, there's no shortage of things that can't be automated or that can be automated. I've got a quick snapshot on the screen, different functions and example tasks, but I'm going to talk through a couple of my favorite tools in this space. The first one, Airtable. So process-oriented tasks that are step-by-step, we should look to automate them where we can, particularly if they're low risk. But Airtable is essentially a spreadsheet meets a database, which can automate or streamline a lot of tasks across the business. So as we can see on the screen, we've got legal, we've got marketing, content, branding, HR, and recruiting. We're going to click into the recruiting. We've got a simple applicant tracker here. As you can see, it looks like a spreadsheet, but it pulls in data from a database. which makes it so much easier to track applicants coming through the system. But there are so many different templates that you might want to check out yourself. We used Airtable in my team to create a proposal generation tool. So rather than spending an hour creating a proposal for a client or a prospect, this tool would spit out a proposal in like 5 minutes. All we need to add is the client name, logo, and price point and the services thereafter. 5 minutes, it spits it out. And then we might spend 10 minutes customizing it, and out it goes. Second tool I wanted to talk about, some of you may be familiar with Zapier, but really simple tool that will get different applications to talk to each other. So if you're manually moving data around, using this will help. So an example, choosing a trigger, Facebook lead collected. Second, that lead gets captured in our email marketing software. So essentially that is, rather than me exporting the leads from Facebook and then manually importing them into my email marketing software, this will do it manually in the background. And there are thousands of integrations that you can check out. Now, these are just 2 tools, but I have prepared a PDF, which is about 30 pages long and has hundreds of tools in it for different parts of the business, which you can download at the link on the screen. And I'll share that link again at the end of the presentation. So that was automate. Now, outsource, of course, O comes before A in P-Codes, but we want to automate something first if we can. If we can't automate it, then we'll outsource it, particularly if it requires a human touch. Now, I would love to know, if you look at the tasks on the screen, what percentage of you would you say, or what percentage of your time rather, would you say you spend on $10 an hour tasks? Tasks similar to these. Less than 5%, Denise, that's fantastic. So I speak to all sorts of corporate executives, high flyers, entrepreneurs, and so many of them will tell me that they're spending somewhere between 30 and 50% of their time on $10 an hour tasks. And if I ask them what the hourly rate is, they'll say 100, 300, 500, 1,000. And so every hour you're spending on these tasks is costing you money if you think about it from the perspective of where you could be spending that time instead. Nowadays, there are a few things that people can't outsource quite easily. A number of them on the screen. And even those little tasks, you know, a 5-minute task done 5 times a day, that's 25 minutes a week, that's 2 hours a week, that's 96 hours across a 48-week work year, which adds up to about 3 standard 35-hour-a-week work weeks. Now, those little tasks can add up. Not only that, but those little tasks are something we need to switch to and can take us out of flow over the course of our days. So what might you look to outsource? Things that are low risk, not core to you or your business, repeatable, not aligned with your strengths, and process oriented step by step. So some of you would be familiar, I'm sure, with platforms like Freelancer or Upwork and the like, but some of you, I'm sure, aren't, because I run a lot of these sessions and oftentimes a lot of people aren't. So if I am looking for someone to help me put a, say, email drip feed together, I can easily find someone within 5 minutes. I can filter it by, say, $10 and below. I can see what work people have done, how successful they've been, and then I can literally be talking to them in a matter of minutes and onboarding them. So it's that easy to outsource simple process-oriented tasks nowadays that you want to get off your plate. The thing is, most people who are critics of outsourcing will say, yeah, I tried it once and it didn't work. Typically, people don't provide clear enough instructions. So you want to do something like this, which is a step-by-step document, or you might look to just do some screen recordings of a process so that you're not leaving anything to chance or assumption, and people know exactly what they need to do to get the job done. Moving on to T in P-Codes, which is testing our assumptions. The 2 biggest productivity killers: 1, jumping to conclusions and spending too much time on things that don't add value, or 2, analysis paralysis. Basically pontificating forever around a boardroom table, what we should do without doing anything at all. And I will answer the questions in the chat window at the end of the session. So how do we get over analysis paralysis and jumping to conclusions? Well, firstly, say it's 2005 or so, and I'm thinking about building Uber. Well, I have a number of assumptions that underpin whether or not I should pursue this. Now, those assumptions would be things like people will get into a car with a stranger, People will use their smartphone to buy things back then, and people want water and mints. Now, we want to see what the impact of these different things is on our idea, if it's successful or not. Now, of course, people getting into a car with a stranger is a 10. How certain are we of that? Well, back then, it was a new novel idea. We weren't certain of it at all. So let's make that a 2. And then again, simply divide that impact over the certainty, and we get the highest score, and that's something we want to test. But how do we test that without building the app, doing the marketing, onboarding drivers? Well, you might just go out to, say, a busy taxi rank and actually talk to people and see if they would spend $20 or so to get home in a private car. Now, at least that way, we're getting real world data that can help us make more informed decisions about whether we move forward with something with caution, or whether we just kill it because the data just isn't there. That gets us out of analysis paralysis and jumping to conclusions where we can waste a lot of time. So that's P code. And to bring us into the S, which is start your engines, I've prepared a short video to kick us off.
So when people talk about healthy mind and healthy body, they typically talk about it like it's some kind of false dichotomy. But the reality is that the body and the mind are fundamentally intertwined. The movement you do to have a healthy body is the same movement you do to have a healthy mind. The food you eat to have a healthy body is the same food you eat to have a healthy mind. We're going to talk all about what you can do to optimize your body to get the absolute best out of your mind.
Okay, so when we're talking about optimizing our body for our mind, the fundamentals: sleep, movement, nutrition. Now, sleep is the ultimate biohack because that deep sleep is fundamental for emotional regulation, creativity, and problem solving. Now, the problem with that is that deep sleep, what's called rapid eye movement sleep, about 3/4 of that we get between the sixth and eighth hour of an 8-hour sleep cycle. But most people aren't getting at 6 hours, let alone 8 hours. Most of us can find ourselves looking at our phones before bed or while we're in bed. And as a result, we're getting nowhere near the prescribed amount of sleep. Now, while it might work for people like Elon, who can routinely work between 80 and 120 hours a week, building multiple billion-dollar companies and enjoying a joint on the Joe Rogan Experience, most of us are not Elon. Most of us are actually between 2 standard deviations from the mean when it comes to how much sleep we need to perform for a sustained period of time. And that is somewhere between 7 and 8 hours. Now, for 5% of the population, they can get away with much less for longer periods of time. But for most of us, we need to learn what we can do to optimize our sleep because it is the ultimate biohack when it comes to our cognition. Now, there are numerous things you can do to optimize your sleep. I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of my favorites is really just not having your phone in the bedroom because you're less inclined to look at it and to see that blue light, which is going to suppress the release of melatonin before bed. If you're struggling to sleep, you're not going to reach for it, which is going to make things worse. And first thing in the morning, if it's on your bedside table, well, we tend to reach for it, check email, and just fill our minds with all sorts of stuff when it's really just a great idea to start your day with at least 10 to 15 minutes of clarity before you start filling it with social media and emails and all sorts of things which just hijack your attention. And when it comes to caffeine, I mean, I'm from Melbourne. Melbourne considers itself the coffee capital of the world. We love our coffee here. But something worth noting is the coffee half-life. So if you have, say, a shot of espresso at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the coffee half-life is actually about 7 hours. So you'll still have half of that espresso shot in your system at about 11 p.m. And this is true of kombucha and green teas and things of that persuasion that have caffeine in them. So something to just be conscious of, because if you are struggling to fall asleep, it could be that afternoon caffeine hit that's causing it. And just an interesting side note on caffeine, many years ago, scientists administered spiders with different stimulants. And you can see the results for yourself. The LSD web and the marijuana web, they're pretty decent web weaving abilities. Caffeine, not so great. Now, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that humans are spiders and this is true of us. Just something I thought I'd share while we're on the topic of caffeine. And to kick us off into the next session, which is all about movement and exercise, I have prepared another video, which in this case, I have prepared purely to give myself a 30-second rest before we get into the next session. Okay, so movement. Now, when we move, our brain sees that as a moment of fight or flight. And it releases what's called BDNF, or brain derived neurotropic factor, which essentially makes us more alert and more focused. So that's why it doesn't really make sense to see people eating lunch at their desk, just plowing through, because oftentimes we would be much better served to go outside for a 10-minute walk in nature. That's going to release that BDNF and it's going to make us way more focused when we get back to our desks. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you, there are countless ways to move, to incorporate movement into our days. Walking is the easiest. But one thing that I find is that in the West, we tend to sit for 8 to 10 hours a day and then go and smash ourselves in the gym for an hour, when perhaps we would be much better served to incorporate that movement into our day, especially when it comes to our work. And this might be something that you might include if you are time blocking your day. Maybe you have 20-minute blocks where you just get outside, do some push-ups, do some body weight squats, whatever your poison is. And that's just going to help you when you are focused on your work. And finally, nutrition. I mean, most of us, I'm sure we're not foreign to the idea of boozy lunches, burgers and fries and beers and things of that persuasion. But we're probably also familiar with the fact that when we do that, we get back to our desks and this is pretty much us. You know, where our cognition, we're a shadow of our former selves, of the person we were before we had that boozy lunch. Now, this is because when we have those big carby lunches, we essentially suffer a glucose or energy crash, a sugar crash. You know, those simple carbs, the white breads, the white rices and things of that persuasion, the sugars, they'll spike our glucose levels. We'll feel energetic for maybe an hour, but then we'll crash and we'll be of no use to anybody for the rest of the day. So what we want to optimize for are the slow release of energy, those slow release carbs. So what does that look like? Well, slow carbs or low GI carbs, you know, essentially sweet potato, brown rice, things of that persuasion, good fats and lean proteins. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what you eat, not overeating, because that's just going to make you feel lethargic and flat when you are back at your desk. So, not going to go through all of these. You can Google slow carbs, good fats. But one thing that may be worth noting is that if you do go out for that boozy, carby lunch, then that's fine if you incorporate a walk afterwards. So, the chart in the top right corner, you can see that the glucose or the sugar crash, it's not really a crash anymore. It's a much more slow release of energy, kind of what we get from low GI carbs. So that after meal walk is a very powerful thing to maintain that cognition in the afternoon. And if you're struggling to get on top of some of these things, again, practice environment design. If I don't want to eat that bag of Doritos while I'm parked on the couch at 10 p.m. watching the live at the Improv through the South by Southwest app, well, then if I didn't have those Doritos in the house, it would make it much more difficult. Instead, if I had those healthy snacks in the house, I'm probably going to reach for one of those. So everything I've talked about today is essentially about helping you get more done in less time, but not only to get closer to your goals faster, but to free up time to live your best life. Because as one of my favorite authors, Hunter S. Thompson, said, life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, wow, what a ride. So, key takeaways. 1, eliminate internal and external distractions. 2, say no more often. 3, stop at the point of diminishing returns. 4, use momentum to beat biology. 5, optimize for the 20% tasks. 6, eliminate low-value tasks. 7, automate and outsource. 8, test your assumptions before committing or not committing to something. 9, optimize your sleep and nutrition. And 10, move. Now, before we get into questions, I've got a whole bunch of free resources for you, some of which I mentioned throughout the talk. You can find them at timereachbook.com. You can download this deck at slidezen.com/IMWU, and that is case sensitive. And I also have a 50% discount code for an online course that I recently launched for you, your colleagues, your friends, which you can also find at timereachbook.com. And that code is SXSW21. Now, I appreciate that was a lot of information, but I try to be insight dense when it comes to my talks to give you as much as you can work with, and then you can go off and try different things and see what works for you. But I am open for questions now, whether they're coming through the chat window, the Q&A window, or whether you actually want to get on the mic and have a bit of a clubhouse and ask questions. So thank you so much. Well, thanks, Agnese. That's very, very kind of you. Okay, so how have I had to deal with a major setback that I had no control over? Well, I guess, I mean, that's a bit of a loaded question. There's many ways I could address that. I mean, losing family members is perhaps a major setback that I've had to deal with, but at the same time, you may have noticed through some of the talks, I mean, I'm a big fan of reading philosophy because I feel like for me, it can help me navigate difficult situations in life. And one thing I've learned from that is that there's certain things you can control and other things that you can't control. And by focusing on what I can control, it just gives me more sort of agency over my life and makes me feel less helpless when things go wrong. And by doing that, like for example, another thing I can talk today is from in a work context where many years ago, one of my first big clients with my company was a large law firm, and the gig that we were doing for them, it was worth quite a bit, but things weren't going to plan. My team wasn't doing what they needed to do. But rather than blame the team, it was a matter of taking ownership, sitting down with them and asking the question, what could we have done better? And then it was on me to call a meeting with my client and say, okay, here's where we stuffed up, here's what we could have done better, and here is what we're going to do about it. And she was very appreciative of that. It wasn't a matter of just saying sorry. It wasn't a matter of blaming someone else or blaming circumstance. It was a matter of taking ownership and again, focusing on what we could control in the moment. And I think that goes a very, very long way. Okay, so Joran asked me, hopefully it's Joran and not Joran, but I'm going to call you Joran unless you correct me. So I'm not necessarily that bullish on 6-hour work days or 4-day work weeks or anything like that, even though I wrote an article about it. It's more so when you have less hours, that acts as a forcing function and it gets you to do away with rudimentary tasks, with pointless meetings. It gets you to think about automating and outsourcing things so that you do get more done in that time period. Now, 4-day work week versus the thing is, if it's 4 days times say 10 hours a day, I'm actually more of a fan of the 6-hour workday because as we've seen today, you know, the upper limit for flow is about 4 hours a day. Whereas if we do 4-day work weeks, but we're still doing 10 hours, chances are we're wasting a lot of hours in those days. Okay, so number 2, you mentioned meetings. I think a lot of the time with meetings, we waste time just with small talk. And I mean, obviously having agenda is one thing, but being clear about exactly what we're looking to achieve in that meeting, who really needs to be there. I think a lot of the times meetings perhaps don't achieve the desired outcome because we have this tendency to outsource accountability and to not want to take the decision for fear of being wrong. Now, this could be a much bigger thing. This could come back to company culture, where instead of pressing the button, hitting the trigger, we tend to delay the decision making as much as possible, particularly as organizations get larger and larger. Now, I have some articles on this, which I will share with you, Joran. So just message me in the South by Southwest online app and I'll get back to you on that. How long does it take to break your bad work habits? Well, the pop science on this says 21 days of doing something is how long it takes. But I think a lot of it comes back to how important is it to you? If you have recently had a young child and you've not really taken care of yourself for years, and then you have a meeting with your doctor and they say, look, you've got to change your ways, otherwise you'll be gone in 6 months. Well, in that case, you're like, well, I want to be there for my child. That's really important to me. You're probably going to change on day one. So it really depends on what are your goals and what do you value and how do your habits actually get between you and those values and those goals. And if they're important enough to you, you will change. But again, you want to practice that environment design. When you create, if you want to break bad habits, create friction. I talked about this, a simple example, the bag of Doritos. When I don't have those Doritos in the house, I'm creating friction. It means I need to get in the car, drive down to the grocery store. I'm not going to do that. So what you can do to create friction between yourself and those bad habits goes a long way. Similarly, on the flip side, removing friction from yourself and those good habits. So some people might say, I want to go to the gym, but the gym is too far away. Well, buy a kettlebell, and then you'll have that kettlebell in your house at your disposal at all times. So thinking about how we can design our environments to make things we want to do easier and to make things we don't want to do harder. Look, I don't. My Kiko, you ask, how do I not feel guilty when I need to take a rest? Well, I think you just need to reframe what that rest represents, which is not slacking off. That rest represents you rejuvenating so that you can bring your best self to that work. You're not of no value to anyone if you're tired and you're not thinking clearly and you're not bringing your best self to the game. So that rest is you doing something that is going to help you meet your goals, be a better employee or founder or whatever the case may be. And that rest doesn't need to be too significant. Also, like if it is mid-afternoon and you're struggling, your attention's flagging, like a 20-minute walk outside is all it takes to get you back to some semblance of alertness. Okay, so Nadil, not really. We basically in the course there's a whole bunch of other stuff, and I don't want to use this as an opportunity to sell the course, but it's about 4 hours of content, a lot of downloadable resources. I talk about how to build high performing teams as well. I talk about remote work, about asynchronous communication, and I dive deeper into some of the concepts that were introduced today. So there's a whole lot more in there, but at the same time, if you've gotten value from today, well, then it might be enough for you. I've definitely left you with enough to start with. Anna Borg, how did you learn the competencies you have developed? Uh, I think my greatest teachers are all behind me. Books, podcasts, audiobooks. My parents came over to Australia in 1971 from what was then Yugoslavia. They both spent their lives working in factories. So while I was inspired by their work ethic, they really didn't know people. They didn't have people in high places. They weren't able to teach me certain things. So I had to basically turn to books. And I also have learned over the years that so much of what I learned in the early days or thought I learned was turned out to be crap. There's a lot of pop science out there. Ultimately, what you need to do is just read widely and also just experiment a lot with different things. And the more you do that, the more you start to find the signal in the noise rather than falling victim to reading something in a book, taking it on face value and just going off and doing things which won't work for you. So the thing about a lot of books is a lot of them fall victim to the narrative fallacy, where because one company or one person did something and it worked for them, well, that must be the magic formula and it's going to work for you too. But that's just not the case. I mean, that's not the case because one person's reality and world circumstances and their business and everything that's going on for them at a certain point in time might be completely different to what's going on with you at another point of time. So just read widely, listen to podcasts, do all these things, try different things and see what works for you. But really the competencies is thanks for saying that, but it's really just trying different things. And I am definitely still a work in progress. So Sarah, how do we suggest that we tell our managers? Now, when it comes to change in large organizations, we have a tendency to think big bang disruption, digital transformation projects that cost millions, if not billions of dollars, depending on the organization. And 90% of the time, those projects actually fail because we're trying to do too much. And we're also, triggering people's change aversion. Now, what we want, how might we present things to managers to try different things? Well, we could say, we could position it in a way where it's about doing the smallest possible thing. How can we test this on just one project, just one time, and see if that works? It reminds me of a story of these chickens that were raised in cages, and they were basically rescued and then brought to a farm. But the thing is, they didn't want to come out of their cages. And there was a circle of cages, and there was a little bit of corn in the middle of all these cages, and the chickens just didn't want to come out. But what the farmer found here was taking that corn, moving it to just 2 inches outside of the cage. And the chicken comes out, pecks a bit, goes back in, then moving it 4 inches, then 6 inches. And then slowly but surely, the chickens learn to leave their cages. Now, it's a silly analogy, but at the same time, when we're trying to get change to transpire at organizations, we need to make it baby steps. And similarly, with a lot of the stuff that I've talked about today, like automation tools, well, can we test this automation tool on this process and see what the value is in this project team? And once we do that, if we generate that value, then interest will grow. It's about going from Snowflake to Avalanche where possible. Again, I actually have a ebook on this. It's called 21 Ways to Get Buy-in from Managers, which you can find at collectivecampus.io/resources. And that's got a whole bunch of other things you might want to try, Sarah. How do you keep productive if your priorities are different to the priorities of your boss, Book? It's a good question. I guess I would, if there were different priorities between employees, work priorities between employees and bosses, then there is some form of misalignment there. And when you don't have values and goals alignment, I mean, that's a recipe for long-term disaster. So something to think about there. But in some cases, again, how can we go from Snowflake to Avalanche? I mean, for example, many years ago, I worked in consulting for the likes of EY and KPMG. And what I often saw was, in terms of personal values, my values were to be out of the office by 6 and to go off and go surfing or see friends and do things like that. But some of the partners, their values were to stay at the office until as late as possible and signal just how busy they were, although I doubt they were very productive at that hour. And in those cases, you need to ask hard questions. And in my case, I actually left those organizations because the values just didn't align with my priorities, my goals. And where possible in life, I mean, if we want to optimize for happiness, not just in work, but in our personal lives, we want to look for values alignment. And if we don't have that, and if we have the conversations with the people that matter and they're still not budging, then tough decisions might need to be made. Kathy, yes, I use Upwork to outsource $10 an hour tasks. Anything in particular you wanted me to elaborate on? I mean, there's so many things you can outsource to Upwork, and you might find someone on there that can help you, like be an all hands type of person. They become your personal VA, which I've brought on a couple of people in that capacity, and they literally do about 30 hours of work each for me each week. And that's stuff that I or someone else who would be much higher paid would have to do otherwise. And it takes so much time. Not only does it take tasks off my hands, but it also creates a lot of value for the organization. Great question, Rosanna. As Peter Drucker said, there's nothing worse than the wrong things done right. And again, whether it's productivity, whether it's looking at Instagram, whether it's being on Clubhouse, whether it's watching Netflix, all of these things can be good and bad. what they all come back to is, what are our values? What do we value? And are we, what do we value? What are our goals? And are we working and acting in accordance with that? Like sitting down for an hour and a half with your kids or your friends and watching a film on TV, that's a bonding experience. But if you're doing it for that experience, that's great. But if you're spending 3 hours a night binge watching Netflix because you're using it as a distraction from other things in your life that go unaddressed, well, that's not so great. So, really taking the time to reflect on what matters to us, where we want to go, what are our values, what are our goals, and working in accordance with that. Um, Now, when people expect 8 hours of work, a that's typically a example of managers anchoring to the past and conflating hours with output, as we might have on the factory room floors. Um, and what is perhaps, I suppose, encouraging about the current time with remote work is it is slowly showing people what's possible when we give people a little bit more freedom to design their days. But if we look at organizations like, say, Automatic, who powers about 30% of the internet, they've got 1,200 employees across 75 countries and a market cap of over $1 billion. No central office, and they barely have any meetings. People design days as they work for them because it's all about outcomes over inputs, all about what they deliver rather than the hours they work. So if you want to work less hours, potentially, Rujana, it could be, again, running small experiments, or it could be that we talk to our bosses first about what we can do to get work off our plates. But really moving to asynchronous teams, I think organizations that do that will have a huge competitive advantage over the next few years over the ones that don't. Alex Marshall. So that's a tough question. I mean, we're talking about, so there's three types of roles, I guess. You might say makers, managers, and minders. Customer service might be a minder role. Now, with any task where you have a value chain of tasks, so customer service could be checking emails, could be answering calls. Obviously, the number one priority there really is answering those phone calls and responding to customer requests. But at the same time, I think having a process whereby we're batching some of these emails, if we can, um, providing there's not some sort of KPI expectation that we get back to people in an hour, and perhaps that could be it. I mean, oftentimes we have these arbitrary expectations around how quickly we need to get back to people, which we impose upon ourselves, and they get in between us and our best work. At the same time, when it is something like customer service, we want to look at things like, well, what's the nature of these requests, and are there ways to automate some of the responses, or are there things that are coming up time and time again that we can address? What are the underlying root causes so that we have less calls coming through and we have more time to focus on the important work rather than the urgent work? Obviously, this is a loaded question and there's so much to talk about in this space. But again, happy to talk about this. I will be running an encore session on Clubhouse. So keep an eye on the how to get more done in less time uh, page on South by Southwest Online. But Alex, we can definitely talk more about that then. Just conscious of how many questions we have coming through, so I'm trying to answer as many as I can. Adrian, picking up a phone and or talking to someone. Yeah, look, it can be depending on what it is. In some cases, 100%. It's much more efficient. Like email should not be a conversational tool where we play tennis all day and it takes us like 20 hours to get to something that could take a 5-minute conversation. Again, when we have certain times of day to batch those phone calls, that means that we're not just switching tasks all day long, which is good. And in some cases, it really comes back to how effective we are with our communication. And if we are, say, sending someone a Slack message that is asynchronous, we want to put forward uh, what do we require? When do we require it by? What are we struggling with? And just being as explicit as possible, because if our written communication isn't explicit and clear, then the response isn't going to be either. And we're going to end up playing tennis games. And that's something that, again, organizations like Basecamp and Automatic, they're very big on written communication because they try to be asynchronous. And when you do that, and when you write clear, effective, explicit messages, the responses you get oftentimes might be as good as a phone call. Now, it really depends on the nuances of that phone call and that conversation. Of course, not all phone calls are created equal. How did the pandemic change the way I work, and am I less productive or more? Well, I mean, the backstory, I spent about 2 to 3 days working remotely before the pandemic, Ed. Thanks for your question. And now it's obviously about 5 days. I mean, I'm in Melbourne, so I'm in a very fortunate position where we are open at the moment, although that we could close at any time. So I am going to the office once every fortnight just because I like to see the team once a fortnight and just change my surroundings, and change my routine. I find that does wonders sometimes for productivity. But one thing I learned working from home was initially my setup just wasn't good from home. I wasn't getting enough natural light. I needed to invest in extended monitors and keyboards and all this sort of stuff, like to make it more pleasant working from home. At the same time, we are open now, so once a day I like to, when I'm working on certain types of work, go out into a cafe maybe for an hour or two, just get the ambience of the cafe going, people around me, that helps me. So again, really noticing what works for you and designing your day around that goes a long way, and which is something I talked about during the session. But I think it's probably made me more productive than less productive, if I was to answer that question, but perhaps not by a lot. I think in one way it definitely did. So 2020 was a year where we all reflected on not only our work but our lives. And I think for me it was more about being more productive by honing in on what do I really want to spend my time doing. Because as I showed in the intro video, I've been doing a lot of things over the last few years, but now I'm really doubling down on just writing books, doing talks, and helping people optimize their time, because this is something that has made a massive difference to my life. And if I can try and make that difference in other people's lives, like that for me is perhaps one of the most rewarding places to be. And if that's doing more rewarding work, well, that for me is being more productive. Top 3 books I recommend. Look, Supreet, you could ask me this question tomorrow and I'd answer differently. Um, One book, perhaps Marcus Aurelius Meditations, which for me it really helped me cultivate more emotional fortitude. Number 2, I mean, classic book, 4 Hour Work Week. I mean, that was probably one of the first books I read that kind of got me thinking about entrepreneurship about 10 years ago. And most recently, I read a book called Calling Bullshit, which essentially looked at how studies and science can be gamed to support certain pre-held or preconceived ideas and belief systems. And I think that is definitely a worthy read, and it gets you to just be a lot more mm, cognizant and not take anything on face value, particularly when it says studies show, because one study doesn't really mean anything. What we really need is an entire body of evidence to really put weight on what a single study shows. So calling bullshit, the 4 Hour Work Week, which is probably pretty cliche by this point, and Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Kathy, virtual assistants and Upwork. Virtual assistant, unless they're Superman or Superwoman, they might not be able to do everything well. They might be a general hand that can help you with certain things that are pretty easy to do, but they might work with you for 15 or 20 hours a week. There's someone that's always there on an ongoing period of time. Whereas if you need something that's a little bit more technical, like you might want to build an automation of some kind with Airtable and you need help, well, your VA might not be able to help with that, but you might find someone on Upwork for $500 who's able to build the entire tool for you. It's a once-off engagement, and they do a job, they do a good job, you move on. So that's kind of the difference. The VA is more for easier tasks, ongoing period of time, whereas for more specific technical tasks, you might turn to an expert on Upwork. Thanks, Joran. Have a great day. If you haven't left already, which I think you have because that was 10 minutes ago, Okay, so I'm just reading through some of the questions. Okay, Agnes asking about splitting your day between morning and afternoon. Okay, so that interrupts your productivity, of course. Well, I would first reflect on, are you an early bird or a night owl? Now, early birds, as I indicated, we're more productive 2 hours after waking up. I say we because I'm an early bird. Night owls more productive 10 hours after waking up. So if you are, say, a night owl, you might try and, in that first morning job, do your deep work later in the day. And in that second job, do it at the start of the shift. Now, if you're an early bird, you're out of luck because then you're going to do your best work in the morning. And by the time you're into that second job, you might start flagging. But again, whatever you can do to heed some of the things I've talked about today, using momentum, doing away with distractions, and just trying to focus on one thing at a time, and trying to ritualize how you work, because ritualizing things makes it sort of second nature to do things a certain way rather than having to kind of sluggishly circumnavigate our way into the day. Not early bird, definitely. Awesome. Well, I think we have some more questions in the Q&A window. Let me see. Whoops. We do have more questions. Renee, what's the biggest mistake I see people making? Really just saying yes to all sorts of requests on their time. Uh, that I cannot stress that one enough. If something comes to you and it's not really aligned with your goals, saying no just frees up so much time straight off the bat. Secondly, just doing all these rudimentary tasks that could be automated or outsourced. Again, that's going to take a lot of time. And then the third thing really is the distractions, reaching for our phones, reaching for social media all day long, constantly taking us out of flow. I mean, those three things, if you focus on them, can save you a lot of time. Anonymous attendee. So you've pushed for time blocking, but management isn't having it. Again, like when we're trying to get change from management, like just try and running an experiment for a day or two, even a week, and just seeing how that goes. If you can get that buy-in, great. Ultimately, again, it comes back to, are we working for an organization that's giving us an opportunity to be our best, to design days as they work for us, or are they not? That's something that we need to think about. Now, a lot of us won't have the liberty of just leaving an organization. We have bills to pay and things of that persuasion. So we need to, in that case, knowing that small steps will get us to where we need to go in terms of that change, but trying not to bite off more than what we can chew when it comes to change at an organization also helps. Now, look, Ryan, you're going to feel overwhelmed whenever you try and do different things, which is why you want to break them down into small chunks. Like reward yourself if if you've never been to the gym before, like rather than let's go 60 minutes a day and lift heavy and do that 5 times a week, just committing to 10 minutes in the gym 2 or 3 times a week and celebrating that. Because that celebration, that dopamine hit that comes with saying, yep, I set out to do this, I did it, that's motivating. So having these positive feedback loops, incorporating them into your work makes it easier to stay motivated rather than trying to incorporate everything I've talked about from day one, which is going to be very difficult. If you can just incorporate small wins into your day, into your work, that's going to go a long way. Which reminds me of something that Scott Belsky also said about teams. You might have annual goals or goals that won't be reached in another 3 years for another 3 years. But if you can create what he calls surrogate metrics. So yes, our goal is to get to 10 million revenue, but in the meantime, we're going to look at other metrics that we're moving towards that show that we're on the right path. So leading indicators, and that can be motivating for a team. Otherwise, you're just working towards something that may or may not come to fruition 3 or 5 years down the track. And that can be really demoralizing when you don't have these uh, positive feedback loops incorporated into your work. Okay, we have 7 more minutes, and I think we are done with all of the questions, unless there is anything else. If there is, if I have missed something, just let me know in the chat window. Otherwise, this has been an absolute delight and an absolute pleasure and honor to be joining you today at South by Southwest, given how many other awesome things are going on at the festival. You chose to sit with me for an hour and 25 minutes, and it's been an absolute delight. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. And again, I will be on Clubhouse at some point in the next few days doing an encore session if you guys wanted to join in for that as well. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Marie, Holly, Robert.